Okay, so you've sent over some really interesting stuff for us to look at. Excerpts from a CPQ study guide and the Salesforce CPQ guidelines. And it seems like they're both kind of zeroing in on this one really important thing,
Right.
which is managing approvals
Yep.
in a CPQ system.
Absolutely.
So today, we're going to take a deep dive into
Yeah.
how these approvals actually work behind the scenes,
Yeah.
especially how they work with other CPQ functions, and what you really need to keep in mind to make sure your deals don't get held up.
Absolutely. And it's really fascinating to see how both of these resources, even though they kind of come at it from slightly different angles, the study guide gives you more of that big picture view, and the Salesforce documentation gets really nitty gritty.
Right.
But they both stress this point that, managing approvals in CPQ isn't always about some separate standalone feature.
Yeah.
It's often really woven into how other parts of the system work. And price rules seem to be a big part of how those approvals get triggered and managed.
Totally. And I saw a perfect example of this in Solution 8
Oh, yeah?
that jumped out at me right away.
Oh,
The scenario with Cosmic Innovation.
right.
So they need their VP of Finance to sign off on any quotes for enterprise clients
Yep.
if the net price on a single quote line goes above a certain amount.
Makes sense.
So they've got this price rule set up
Okay.
to flag those lines for approval, which seems pretty straightforward at first glance. But here's where it gets a little strange.
Okay.
The user has to click that calculate button, not once,
Yeah.
but twice
Oh,
to get that approval flag to show up.
interesting.
So what's the deal with needing to click it twice?
So that double calculate thing
Yeah.
often points to one specific thing going on.
Okay.
And Solution 8 hits the nail on the head with this one.
Right.
It's a referenced custom formula field. Think about it this way. Your price rule isn't looking directly at some static data field, right?
Yeah.
It's looking at the result of a calculation that's happening inside this custom formula.
Okay.
And the timing of these calculations is really key.
Got it.
The first time you hit calculate the system might still be busy updating all the bits of info that feed into that formula. So at that exact moment, the formula itself doesn't have all the updated values it needs.
It's kind of like a chef waiting for all the ingredients to be prepped before they can make the dish.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay.
And that first calculation cycle is usually what updates those underlying ingredient fields.
Right.
Then when you hit calculate again,
That second time.
the formula field finally has all the latest info. It does its thing. And only then can the price rule look at that net price, see if it's over the limit, and correctly flag that quote line
Okay.
for the VP of Finance's approval.
So what you're saying is
Yeah.
when we're setting up these CPQ rules, we should really try to base that important logic, like what triggers an approval,
Yes.
on fields that get updated in a straightforward way
Exactly.
and in a predictable time.
Right, because if you rely too much on those complex formula fields for these core functions, you might run into timing problems and get some weird behavior.
Okay, so let's say our listener is out there dealing with some of these same approval headaches. What's the big takeaway for them?
I think the main thing here is to really dig into how everything works together in your CPQ environment.
Oh.
Like, what's the sequence of all the operations and
Right.
how do the different fields relate to each other?
Yeah.
If your approval workflows are depending on fields that are themselves the result of calculations, especially those ones involving custom formulas, you need to know exactly when those calculations are happening.
Yep.
Something that seems like a simple approval rule on the surface might actually be built on a much more complicated web of data flows and calculation timings. If you're running into situations where approvals are getting delayed for no clear reason, or your users are having to jump through extra hoops, a good place to start troubleshooting is to look at when your calculations are happening and which fields are involved.
Gotcha. It's kind of like thinking about how even a simple light switch
Right.
might be hooked up to a whole complicated electrical circuit.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about what happens when you need to move these carefully configured approval systems from one Salesforce environment to another, like from your testing sandbox to your live production system.
This is where solutions 6 and 7 come in.
Okay.
Along with that section on CPQ, object data model, and data migration, let's go back to our example price rule.
That flags the high value quote lines.
Exactly, the
Right.
one that triggers the approval.
Yeah.
Imagine you're moving this over to a testing environment,
Right.
similar to what's described in requirement 6 for a different rule.
Okay.
And in this testing environment, the setting triggers disabled is set to true.
Right.
This is a pretty standard practice during migrations.
Yeah.
It's a smart move to make sure you don't accidentally set off automated actions too early.
Because you wouldn't want approval requests or emails going out in your test environment with data that's not finished or accurate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the crucial thing to remember here, and Solution 6 really emphasizes this, is that after you finish your migration, you absolutely have to go back and set triggers disabled back to false.
Okay.
You can find that setting set up, then under installed packages, then Salesforce CPQ, then configure, and finally additional settings.
Got it.
But there's actually more to it than just flipping that switch back.
Oh, there's even more steps involved.
There is. Solution 6 also mentions another very important step. You need to re-execute the post-install scripts.
And post-install scripts.
Think of the CPQ calculator as this super efficient engine that only pays attention to certain data points it knows it needs for its calculations. When you migrate configurations, you need to specifically tell the system which fields are now relevant for this engine to consider. And that's basically what running those post-install scripts again and updating those calculator referenced fields does.
Interesting.
If your price action is set up to update a field that's used to start an approval, you need to make sure the calculator is aware of this target field.
I see.
Rerunning the post-install scripts makes sure that these target fields are registered correctly and will be updated the way they should be in the new environment without any problems.
So it's not just about switching that triggers disabled setting back.
Yeah.
You need to make sure the whole system is recognizing and using all the configurations you just moved over.
Exactly.
It's almost like you've moved all the furniture into a new house, but you still need to tell the electrical system where all the outlets are now.
That's a great analogy. And this also ties back to the bigger idea of how CPQ organizes its data and configurations, what's often called the CPQ object data model, and the right ways to move this data, which is touched on in that CPQ object data model and data migration section. When you're migrating different parts of CPQ, you need to think about how they're related and the correct order to migrate them in. For example, you usually want to move your product catalog over before you move any product rules that rely on those products.
Makes sense.
It's a very carefully planned process.
It sounds like you really have to do a little dance with your CPQ setup.
You do.
One wrong step, and your approvals could end up not working right in the new environment.
Absolutely.
And speaking of rules and configurations that can affect approvals, Solution 7 brings up another interesting point. Lookup queries.
Right.
You can use these inside price rules to pull in data from outside sources. Maybe changing approval limits based on a customer's credit rating or something like that.
Exactly.
It's a way to add some dynamic intelligence to your approval workflows.
That's right.
So instead of having a fixed net price that triggers an approval, it could be a threshold that changes automatically based on information coming in from another system.
That's the idea.
But there's a really big catch with lookup queries, that you need to be careful about the combination of conditions you set up in your lookup query can never bring back more than one row of data.
Super important.
If it does, Solution 7 is very clear that you'll get an error message in the quote line editor.
Right.
And the whole calculation process, including any updates to your approval-related fields, will just stop working.
Yeah, the field that was supposed to trigger the approval will just stay at its original value.
Oh, wow. So that could lead to missed approvals?
Yeah, definitely.
And some confused salespeople.
For sure.
On the other hand, Solution 7 also says that if your lookup query comes back with no rows, meaning it doesn't find any matching record in the external data, CPQ won't carry out the price actions that go with that rule. So if your approval flag was supposed to be set based on a lookup that doesn't find a match, it just won't happen.
Exactly. So it's very precise. You have to make sure your lookup queries are designed to return exactly one result when you need a certain condition to be met. And maybe 0 results when it shouldn't be met.
There's not a lot of wiggle room.
Not really, no. It shows just how important it is to plan those lookup queries out carefully. To make sure they're giving you the right result or no result when you need it, to make your approval logic work the way it's supposed to.
It's not just about the price rule itself. It's about making sure the data it's using from that external source is solid and accurate, and that you're asking for that data in the right way.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been a really in-depth look at managing approvals in CPQ.
Yeah.
We've seen how things like price rules, Custom formulas and data migration can have a big impact even though they don't seem directly related to approvals at first glance. We talked about how the timing of those calculations with formula fields can cause some head-scratching moments.
Yeah.
And the essential steps you need to take to make sure your approval logic is working correctly after you move your system.
Right.
And we even got into the level of detail you need when you're using lookup queries that might trigger approvals.
What I think is really amazing when you consider all these different parts working together is just how connected everything is within the CPQ system.
Right.
Setting up a rule to start an approval isn't some isolated task.
Yeah.
You need to have a really good grasp of the entire flow from when the data first comes in to all the calculations that happen, even down to those system-level settings that control how configurations work when you move them between environments.
So as we wrap things up here,
Yeah.
think about this. Given all this complex interaction between calculations, field dependencies, and system configurations that we've been talking about,
Right.
what's one unexpected thing that could be lurking in your CPQ environment that might delay or even completely stop those important approvals from happening?
That's a great question.
It's definitely something to give some serious thought to.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.